On the corner of Maple Street, beneath the faded awning of an old bakery long out of business, sat George, a weathered man who had seen more years than most cared to count. His face was lined with deep creases, telling a story of hardship, resilience, and survival. His clothes, tattered and worn, hinted at the many cold nights spent sleeping under bridges, in alleyways, or anywhere that offered a little protection from the elements. Yet despite his circumstances, George's eyes still held a spark of kindness that never dimmed. George had not always been homeless. There was a time, years ago, when he had a home, a family, and a steady job. But life, as it sometimes does, took an unexpected turn. A series of misfortunes, bad investments, and a tragic accident left him alone, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the memories of better times. He had tried to rebuild, but it was as if the world had turned its back on him. Every morning, George would wake up on his makeshift bed of cardboard and thin blankets, roll up his belongings into a small bundle, and set up his spot on the corner of Maple Street. He held out a small tin can, where passers-by would sometimes toss a few coins or a dollar bill. Some days were better than others, but George always managed to scrape together enough to get by. One morning, as the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, George noticed a thin, scraggly dog wandering the street. The dog was small, with a matted coat of brown fur and ribs that jutted out from under its skin. It moved with a cautious grace, as if it had learned long ago not to trust humans too easily. George watched the dog from his spot, his heart aching for the poor creature. He knew the feeling all too well, hungry, cold, and alone. "Hey there, fella," George called softly, holding out a small piece of bread he had saved from his breakfast. The dog paused, its eyes darting between George and the bread. After a moment of hesitation, it crept forward, nose twitching as it sniffed the air. With a quick movement, it snatched the bread from George's hand and retreated a few steps to eat. George smiled. "Don't worry, I won't hurt ya. Come back tomorrow, and I'll have more for you." And so began their daily ritual. Each morning, the dog, whom George affectionately named Buddy, would return to George's corner, and George would share whatever scraps of food he could spare. Buddy grew more comfortable with George, inching closer each day, until eventually, he began to sit by George's side, tail wagging in anticipation. The bond between the two grew strong, forged in the shared experience of survival. Buddy was no ordinary stray. Though he had been abandoned by his previous owners, something about him remained fiercely loyal. He became George's companion, his silent guardian. Where George went, Buddy followed, always watching, always alert. Despite his small size, Buddy had a brave heart, and George took great comfort in the dog's presence. One chilly autumn afternoon, George sat in his usual spot, the streets bustling with people going about their day. The crisp air was filled with the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. Buddy sat beside George, his head resting on George's knee as they watched the world go by. The tin can in front of them jingled with a few coins, a decent haul for the day. As the afternoon wore on, George noticed two men approaching him from across the street. There was something unsettling about them. Their eyes were cold, their clothes dark and ragged. They exchanged a glance with each other, then looked at George with an expression that sent a shiver down his spine. George had been on the streets long enough to recognize trouble when he saw it. "Hey, old man," one of the men sneered as they drew closer. "Looks like you've got a bit of change there. Mind sharing?" George's heart raced. He had learned to deal with harsh words and occasional threats, but something about these men told him they weren't going to leave peacefully. He instinctively moved his hand over the tin can, as if protecting the few donations he had collected. "I don't want any trouble," George said calmly, trying to diffuse the situation. "Just a few coins to get by. That's all I've got." The second man, taller and more menacing, stepped forward. "We ain't a skin," he growled. "Hand it over, or we'll take it ourselves." Buddy, sensing the tension, stood up from his spot beside George. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. The dog's sudden shift in demeanor caught the men off guard, but they quickly dismissed him as a minor threat. "Oh, look, the old man's got himself a little guard dog," the first man laughed, taking a step closer. "Too bad he's not much more than a mutt." In that instant, something changed in Buddy. The timid, scrappy dog that George had fed every day transformed into a fierce protector. With a snarl, Buddy launched himself at the men, teeth bared, eyes blazing with determination. The men, caught off guard, stumbled backward as Buddy snapped and barked, refusing to let them get any closer to George. "Get off, you filthy mutt!" the taller man yelled, trying to kick Buddy away. But Buddy was relentless. He darted around their legs, biting at their ankles, forcing them to retreat further and further. The first man cursed under his breath, realizing that they had underestimated both George and his dog. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, grabbing his companion by the arm. "This ain't worth it." With one final growl, Buddy chased them down the street, ensuring they wouldn't return. Once they were gone, he trotted back to George, tail wagging triumphantly. George, still in shock from the encounter, knelt down and wrapped his arms around Buddy's neck. "Good boy," George whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Buddy. You saved us." In the days that followed, word of what had happened spread through the neighborhood. People who had once walked by George without a second glance now stopped to chat, asking about Buddy and offering kind words. Some even left extra food or money for George and his loyal companion. It seemed that Buddy's bravery had touched the hearts of many. One day, a woman named Emily stopped by George's corner. She had been walking her own dog when she overheard a couple talking about the homeless man and his protective stray. Intrigued, she decided to see for herself. As she approached, she saw George sitting with Buddy by his side, the two of them sharing a quiet moment. Emily was struck by the scene. The way George, despite his hardships, still found the capacity for kindness, and how Buddy, once a lost and hungry stray, had become George's guardian. "Hi there," Emily said softly, kneeling down to pet Buddy. "I heard about what happened the other day. Your dog is quite the hero." George smiled, scratching Buddy behind the ears. "Yeah, he's a good boy. I don't know what I'd do without him." Emily hesitated for a moment, then said, "You know, I work at an animal shelter nearby. We have a program where we help homeless individuals take care of their pets, food, medical care, whatever they need. I'd be happy to help you with Buddy, if you'd like." George looked up, surprised by the offer. That's very kind of you," he said slowly, "but I don't want to be a burden." "It's no burden at all," Emily assured him. "We believe that everyone deserves a companion, and we want to help make sure Buddy is healthy and happy." Tears welled up in George's eyes as he realized that, for the first time in a long while, someone was offering him kindness without expecting anything in return. He nodded, grateful beyond words. From that day forward, George and Buddy's lives began to change. With Emily's help, Buddy received regular checkups, vaccinations, and plenty of food. The community, inspired by their story, began to rally around George, offering not just donations, but friendship and support. George, in turn, shared what little he had with others, always remembering the kindness that had been shown to him. Though George remained homeless, he no longer felt invisible. He had Buddy by his side, a loyal companion who had once been a stray but had found a home in George's heart. Together, they faced the world with humility, kindness, and an unbreakable bond forged in the shared struggle for survival. In the end, it wasn't just George who had saved Buddy. It was Buddy who had saved George, in more ways than one. And through their story, they reminded everyone around them of the power of kindness, loyalty, and the simple act of caring for one another.